Today's review looks extensively at the thermals and noise of MSI's RX 5700 XT Evoke OC card. It's named OC because it has a higher stock clock than average and higher than some other partner models too, although the actual overclocking performance for all of these cards is limited primarily by silicon quality and memory controller quality, not really by PCB. All right, so first thing, 4 screws for the GPU heatsink, and there's a warranty void if removed sticker on it, which is illegal in the US to have that sticker. So that's bad, and MSI should get rid of it, and also they should feel bad. We don't like these warranty void if removed stickers. It's infringing on right to repair, and also not enforceable, and also illegal in the US. Anyway, we'll take the screws out. Actually, I think MSI may have been on a list with Asus for people getting in trouble for those. Asus was definitely on the list. That'll free the heatsink, but we need to get it out from under the shroud, which is probably going to require taking out a few more screws. So you can see that this screw in the back plate is going through the PCB into the base plate, and that's true in a few places. So let's pull those out. I think these are probably the same size. Yep, so we're just using a PH1 screwdriver from our toolkit, again on the store. There's only 2 screws back here. You can see screws coming in through the base plate on the other side into these locations, those 4 locations. We might need to take some more out. Okay, there we go. That's free. I don't think the I/O plate had to come off, but it made it a bit easier. We're gonna have to pull the cables. So there's a fan cable down here. Right there. Might be one more cable somewhere. Remember not to pull by the actual wires. It is very likely that you rip the fan header off the PCB if you do that. Only pull by the header itself. Sometimes you can use a flathead to make that easier. All right, so that's freed, but we're actually still stuck up here. Whoop-bye. What's holding us? Glue? Oh, it's tape. Wow, okay. That's interesting choice. Tape, double-sided tape. Not really. Doesn't really seem necessary, but whatever. There's a lot of screws in there already. So it probably holds it a bit tighter to keep these flush. So if you never open it, it's fine. This is not gonna really stay sticky anymore now that it's been opened. So if you open it, you'll have to replace that or just peel it off and ignore it was ever there. It probably won't be quite as flush. There's the card. This is a pretty liquidy thermal paste actually, more than we normally see. Some of the Shin-Etsu stuff doesn't really. A lot of the common pastes are not that liquidy once you pull the shroud off or the heatsink off. And we now see the biggest problem. Man, this is so bad. So if you remember, our biggest complaint with this card was the memory thermals. It was the difference between saying, you know what, it really doesn't matter if you buy Sapphire or MSI, and saying buy Sapphire, which is what we said. Look at that. That's not because half of it came off on the heatsink when I pulled it off. That's how they made it. That's not even 50% of the memory. They didn't even get the hottest spot of this memory module. It's not the left side. It's dead center. So if anything, if you're gonna only cover part of it, at least cover like the center 60 or 70%. That's terrible. That's a bad design. So I'm thinking MSI was trying to avoid retooling. I don't know. I'm not sure the details, but maybe they had this plate tooled from a different card previously, maybe Polaris, maybe something else, and didn't want to retool it. And if that's the case, it would be a cost-saving measure, and then you just go with good enough, which is what they did here. You can see that only part of the memory module is contacting the heatsink, which is dumb. That $12, that's cost for the consumer for buying a few memory modules worth of thermal pads, enough for one video card. So you could basically fix the card with a thermal pad purchase. You can get them for cheap if you bought a cheaper package. The -8 pads are something like maybe $12, $11, $12 if you buy an amount that's good enough to fit this card, and that's it. That's the size of a GDDR6 module. It's about exactly one of those thermal pads. They're pretty cut to size. This is the size of an MSI's thermal pad, and here's the bigger problem. The pads where MSI positioned them are not centered, and the hottest spot of a memory module is going to be the middle, because that's where the silicon is. It's where the silicon's the hottest too. So yeah, it's a matter of wrong size pad, bad placement of the pad, and then we don't know how good the quality of them is in terms of thermal conductivity, but at the end of the day, it's sort of irrelevant if they're not really placed in the right place. Anyway, take a few screws out and replace the thermal pads, easy enough. No real danger there. Replace the thermal paste while you're at it because it'll be exposed to air and you'll pull it apart, so it's not going to line up anymore anyway. So that's the way to do it. You could always add a small washer while you're at it. We actually added some washers for contact reasons. So when you take this apart, make sure a few things. Make sure the thermal pads are cut exactly to size. If they're too big and they go over other components, you might have clearance issues getting the cooler back on. And then separately, check your junction temperatures when you plug it back in and run it in the system. If junction is really high or the delta between GPU and junction, you can use GPZ for this, is greater than maybe say 20, 30 degrees, probably ideally closer to 20, then there might be a problem. So we had to redo this mod once because when reassembling the card, the junction temperature skyrocketed, and that's because there wasn't proper contact on the GPU silicon, even though the memory contact was fixed. And that's just a matter of mounting tension, screw tension, make sure everything's torqued down. And then if you do add washers to increase the pressure, be careful to not increase it too much to a point where you can crack the silicon, because that can happen. Ideally do it without the extra washers, but if you add them, get skinny plastic ones. That way, one, they're not too thick, and two, you probably break the plastic before anything else. MSI had confirmed our testing results, but also told us that it was working on solutions. Today, we're revisiting the MSI 5700 XT Evoke to see if those promises have been met. The short of it was that basically MSI used pads that on the top two memory modules on this card, there's two of them at the top and then the rest are on the side. The top two had thermal pads that were about 40% of the size of the memory module. We have footage kind of comparing the normal size versus the smaller size if you need it. And then also the pads were not positioned on the center. And a couple things about GDDR6, it's a flip chip package, so it's flip chip BGA, and that means that the actual heat source is going to be closer to the PCB than closer to the top of the module, so it'll be this direction. And additionally, that heat source is in the center of the black module on top of the PCB. So having the thermal pad off center, having no thermal pads on the back plate, which then becomes a heat trap, and also having pads that were too small meant that the MSI Evoke impressively had, by a lot, the worst GDDR6 thermals out of all of the 5700 XT cards that we tested. The fix is to add thermal pads to the back plate. We're going to show some of that footage, and thermal pads to the front of the card that are more centered. They did not increase the size of the thermal pads on the front, but they centered them properly on the modules. That helped a lot, and then the pads on the back plate helped a lot because, again, it's flip chip BGA, and a back plate with no connection to the PCB becomes a heat trap because the air can't get out and it's just burning up in there. So those things were the attempted solutions. The back plate, it wasn't like this before. Previously, the back plate had nothing on it for thermal pads. It was blank. And they've added a few bumpers, rubber bumpers to the edges, which is fine. The thermal pads, though, were added in the memory area. They make full contact for the most part. One of the things in talking with MSI, they were able to validate our testing results, and in trying to find a solution for this, MSI noticed that having the thermal pad encase, kind of spill over the edge of the module on the PCB was helpful for thermals, but they weren't able for other reasons to do that in the design. I'll talk about that more in a moment. The backplate, though, so there's pads added for the VRM, pads added for the memory, and then interestingly, if you peel back one of these thermal pads, you'll see that the plastic sheath here that protects the back of the card from shorting the through hole components to the back plate, that protective layering is still underneath the thermal pads. So there's things MSI can still improve on. It absolutely works way better than it did before. Just as a small note though, like tiny things to improve on that maybe could add another degree of improvement. I don't know, I haven't validated it. It's not really worth validating at this point. They've done well enough. But MSI could cut out the hole for the thermal pad so that it makes direct contact to the actual aluminum, like to the metal, the thing that sinks the heat. So small stuff like that could be further improved. So that's the challenge. Backplate's definitely improved. The front side of the card, most of the pads are on here. It's still got some small pads, as you can see. There's actually, they've added in a little carriage, a punch out around the memory modules. So the pads are positioned on the center of those punch outs now for the top ones, and then at the border for the side ones. That wasn't there on the original heatsink. It's just a guidance thing for the people doing the hand placement of the thermal pads. And they are centered, which is really what a lot of the improvement comes from other than the backplate. But MSI told us that the PMs were saying they'd rather have had full-size thermal pads that do slightly spill over the edge of the module, or at least cover the whole top of it. But for some reason, we're still not 100% clear on they weren't able to do that. And it sounded like it was a mounting pressure issue. But there's a lot of reasons I'm not sure if I can say I disagree because I don't know that I understand. But it sounded like MSI was claiming that these memory modules at the top were much closer to the GPU package than they had expected when they originally designed the card. And that once they, once AMD provided the specs and the reference boards, MSI was not prepared for how close they were to the GPU. And so some reason claims that a thermal pad that covers the entirety of the bottom side of the memory modules for the top would cause a fitment issue or clearance issue. But you then look at their RTX and GTX designs where they've cut the same corner and they're doing the same thing, even though the memory is spaced differently. So not really sure that I agree, but I'm also not sure that I fully understand what they were talking about. And I don't really know that necessarily the people we spoke with do either. This seems like maybe something more of a factory level issue. So the issue is being communicated from someone at a factory, which MSI does own, and then through someone probably in management, through a PM, through PR, and then to us. So who the hell knows what the original statement was? But that's what we were told. At the end of the day, though, they've improved it to the extent that is possible without fully retooling the card, and I guess that's all you can really ask.
This is an MSI 5700 Evoke GP, the non-XT Evoke variant with supposedly extra thermal pad coverage, at least that's what I was told. We're going to tear it apart and check on that, but I first want to check temps before tampering with internals to see if the issues plaguing the Evoke family in the past are still lurking. First up, temps across the board. I clocked 88 degrees Celsius at the junction, 74 degrees for the memory, it's GDDR6 in this case, and 71 degrees on the GPU, and that's what you're seeing in this graph. Junction or hotspot temps often run upwards of 100 degrees Celsius and higher, and are still deemed within spec by nature of how this temperature is measured, so I don't see any apparent issues here. Memory looks great too, to my surprise. I didn't see any throttling or anything of any kind, and substrate temps are nice and cool, just over 70 degrees Celsius. But I mean, so what? The XT Evoke temps were decent too. It was the sound that really killed it. The card had to ramp up its fan curve to remain cool enough to be deemed acceptable for an aftermarket cooler. I was so surprised though by how well the 5700 GP performed. The card ran ultra quiet. My personal rig at idle, which was sitting about 8 feet away, was making more noise than this test bench. And granted, we were running it on open air, but I imagine any case with modest airflow would yield similar figures, and we've proven that when you run an open air test bench, but then you also have fans in a case actively pulling fresh air, and you're talking about a case that doesn't inhibit airflow very much, it could actually be beneficial to run a system in a case. So depending on how you look at it, it could be a pro or a con. And look, I know this is just the 5700, not the XT. It's a lower spec card, so I expect it on paper to run a bit, cooler clock for clock, but this thing was incredibly quiet. I was actually a bit concerned because I didn't feel like the card was under a heavy enough load in the Dirt Rally benchmark. I always use Dirt Rally because it's you just loop that benchmark for 30 minutes straight. It's consistent, it's repetitive over and over. But the GPU was pegging 100% usage, and memory was under load as well. And those temps, you saw them earlier, were within spec, and the card was extremely quiet. The fan curve is super conservative here, and the card still managed to stay very quiet under that load. So I'm impressed. I didn't expect that. Let's take it apart. Did MSI actually do what they said they did? Did they replace the thermal pads? Did they add thermal pads? Based on my own testing, I'd assume they did, but I want to take a look anyway. And wow, same size thermal pads that I found in our 5700 XT Evoke sample. Honestly, kind of disappointing. And I'm going off script here at this point because MSI has gotten back to me personally and talked about what they had said they did to this card prior to me agreeing to use it.